Yeah, we back, ladies and gentlemen. I had a little like 5 day suspension because YouTube said I didn't follow the guidelines when I posted the thumbnail of Cheryl Parker head on a Baphomet body. They said that was nudity. But anyway, let's get into we talking about slavery now. Let's talk about white slavery. The unforgotten story of white slavery that they don't talk about. But y'all talk about black slavery, the white man was mean, this, that, and the third. But let's talk about white slavery, the unforgotten story. Let's get into it, ladies and gentlemen. Like I said, we had white slaves, black slaves, any kind of slave you name, we had, goddammit, on this American soil. Let's get into it.
Slavery and its history today feels like taboo in discussions. It is one of the avoided things to talk about at this time. We cannot also deny that slavery has been around in different types of ethnicity and countries, many of which are often forgotten, and much worse, suppressed. Today on History in Minutes, we'll be diving deeper into the real history of the white slave trade. The narrative of slavery is more intricate than what has been presented to you. Were you aware that North Africa received up to 1.25 million white slaves? Did you know that 1/5 of the 1797 U.S. government budget was used to pay tribute to North African Muslim nations to free and halt the enslavement of Americans? The Ottoman Empire enslaved millions of Europeans, and in ancient Britain, slavery was so pervasive that the term Breton was used interchangeably with slave in Anglo-Saxon language. Additionally, owning and trading slaves was a worldwide practice. It's important to acknowledge these facts and reconsider our connection to history and its aftermath. The scourge of slavery affected individuals in nearly every culture, region, and era of history.
Facts.
Although the term slave often conjures thoughts of the atrocities committed during the transatlantic slave trade, the practice of enslaving human beings was common in both ancient and modern times and persists to this day. Presently, the estimated number of individuals enduring enslavement ranges from 38 million to 46 million, highlighting the ongoing nature of this abhorrent practice. The focus of societal scrutiny and censure has been primarily centered on the devastating African slave trade that occurred between the 16th and 19th centuries. Regrettably, an equally reprehensible trade in Barbary, slaves existed concurrently in the Mediterranean region. This insidious trade involved Barbary corsairs, and it is believed that they enslaved up to 1.25 million Europeans. These individuals, who have since become recognized as the white slaves of Barbary, were subject to lives of comparable wretchedness to their African counterparts. The Barbary slaves were a group of people who were captured and enslaved by Barbary pirates operating in the Mediterranean Sea and along the North African coast between the 16th and 19th centuries. These pirates, who were primarily from the North African countries of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya, targeted ships from Europe and the Americas, as well as coastal towns and villages in search of plunder and captives to sell into slavery. The Barbary pirates were able to capture slaves from a wide range of ethnic and religious backgrounds, including Europeans, Africans, and Middle Easterners. Some of the most famous examples of Barbary slaves were Europeans from countries such as Italy, Spain, and Ireland, who were captured while sailing or living along the Mediterranean coast. The corsairs, who were very unsatisfied with their scopes of capture, not only targeted ships and sailors, but also frequently raided coastal settlements in several European countries, including Italy, France, Spain, Portugal, England, Ireland, the Netherlands, and even as far away as Iceland. These attacks were carried out by landing on unguarded beaches and sneaking up on villages under cover of darkness to capture their victims. One particularly devastating attack took place in 1631, when almost all of the inhabitants of the village of Baltimore in Ireland were taken by the corsairs in this way. The threat of such raids led to widespread fear and panic among coastal communities, and many towns were almost completely abandoned by their inhabitants until the 19th century. The corsairs' raids had a significant impact on social and economic development of coastal regions in the Mediterranean, as well as on the cultural heritage of affected communities. The fear of being captured and enslaved caused many people to abandon their homes and flee inland, leaving behind empty towns and villages that were vulnerable to further attacks. The impact of the Corsairs' raids was not limited to the Mediterranean, however. Coastal communities in other parts of Europe were also affected, and the threat of piracy led to the development of coastal defense and an establishment of naval patrols to protect ships in coastal towns. The Barbary Corsairs' raid on the coastal village of Baltimore in Ireland is widely regarded as one of the most brutal and heinous acts committed by these pirates. In the early hours of June 20th, 1631, more than 200 Corsairs arrived on the shores of Baltimore, armed with a variety of weapons including muskets, iron bars, and burning sticks. The Corsairs silently made their way to cottages and homes along the shoreline and in the main village, waiting outside the front doors until a signal was given. Then they stormed into the homes, seizing the unsuspecting inhabitants from their beds. Men, women, and children, numbering 107 in total, were dragged onto ships and taken back to Algiers. Upon their arrival, the residents of Baltimore were taken to slave pens where they were chained and nearly naked and paraded before prospective buyers. Men were typically forced to work as laborers, while women were often used as concubines. Children were often raised as Muslims and incorporated into the slave corps within the Ottoman army. During the 13th and 14th centuries, the Mediterranean was dominated by Christian pirates, mainly hailing from Catalonia and Sicily, who posed a significant threat to merchants traversing the seas. However, the situation changed in the 15th century with the expansion of the Ottoman Empire, which marked the beginning of the rise of Barbary Corsairs as a threat to Christian shipping. By the 16th century, the Barbary Corsairs had established themselves as a force to be reckoned with, preying on the ships of the Mediterranean powers, including Venice, Spain, and France. However, it was not until the arrival of European pirates in the early 17th century that the Corsairs were able to expand their operations beyond the Mediterranean. The European pirates brought with them the advanced sailing and shipbuilding techniques that enabled the Barbary Corsairs to extend their activities into the Atlantic Ocean. This resulted in the Corsairs being able to target ships from countries such as England, Ireland, Portugal, and the Netherlands, which were now within their reach. The common story surrounding the Barbary slave trade often portrays Muslim Corsairs capturing white Christian victims. However, this portrayal is too simplistic and does not reflect the reality of the situation. The Corsairs were not motivated by race or religious orientation of those they captured, as slaves in Barbary were of all different races and religions, including black, brown, white, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, Jewish, or Muslim. Furthermore, the Corsairs themselves were not solely Muslim. English privateers and Dutch captains also took part in the slave trade, exploiting the political instability of the time, in which alliances and enemies could change quickly. Robert Davis, a historian and author of Christian Slaves, Muslim Masters, White Slavery in the Mediterranean, the Barbary Coast, and Italy, notes that the idea that slavery was always racial in nature is a false one. Slavery in Barbary was not solely based on race, but rather on the demand for labor and the capture of people through piracy. Davis also argues that the history of white slavery has been overlooked or minimized by scholars who prefer to view Europeans as colonial oppressors rather than the victims of slavery. This perspective may be controversial, but it highlights the complexity of the Barbary slave trade and the need for a more nuanced understanding of its history. The Barbary slave trade was a brutal and dehumanizing system that subjected captured individuals to horrific treatment. Many slaves did not survive the long voyage back to North Africa due to disease, malnutrition, and the lack of water. Those who did survive were taken to the slave markets, where they were put on display for buyers to inspect before being sold at auction. Once purchased, slaves were put to work in various ways depending on their gender and physical condition. Men were often assigned to work hard manual labor, such as working in quarries or heavy construction. Women were used for domestic work or sexual servitude. At night, slaves were confined to bangios, which were overcrowded and often unbearably hot. Perhaps the most harrowing fate for a Barbary slave was being assigned to man the oars of galleys. Rowers were shackled in place and never allowed to leave their seat. They ate, slept, defecated, and urinated in the same position, often for months or even years on end. Overseers would beat slaves with a whip to keep them rowing, and anyone deemed not to be working hard enough would be brutally punished. The system of Barbary slaves was designed to strip individuals of their humanity, reducing them to nothing more than property to be bought and sold. The conditions were inhumane and degrading, and the suffering endured by the slaves was immense. As the 17th century drew to a close, the power of the Barbary pirates began to dwindle as European navies became more powerful and started to retaliate against their attacks on merchant ships. However, it wasn't until the 19th century that a more coordinated effort was made to quell the pirates' activities. The United States of America and some European nations began to take a more aggressive action against the Barbary pirates. Algiers, the main base of the Corsairs, was frequently bombarded by the French, Spanish, and the Americans. The Anglo-Dutch raid in 1816 on Algiers was particularly significant, as it forced the Corsairs to agree to terms which included the enslavement of Christians. Despite this, the slave trade of non-Europeans was allowed to continue. Even after these efforts, occasional incidents of piracy still occurred. The British launched another raid on Algiers in 1824, and the French eventually invaded Algiers in 1830, placing it under colonial rule. Similarly, Tunisia was invaded by France in 1881, and Tripoli fell into Italian hands in the 1911 Italo-Turkish War. It wasn't until European governments passed laws granting emancipation to slaves that the practice of slavery finally ceased on the Barbary coast. The slave trade, which had been a thriving industry for centuries, was officially ended, and the remaining slaves were granted their freedom. This was a significant step towards the fight against slavery and the protection of human rights. Today, the memory of the Barbary slaves serves as a reminder of the horrors of slavery and the importance of the continuing efforts to eradicate it. That's it for today's video. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you learned something new. We'll see you next time for more History in Minutes.
We know the story of slavery in America. Millions of Africans kidnapped, sold, and shipped to the New World. But there is another story, a forgotten chapter. Between the 16th and 18th centuries, hundreds of thousands of Europeans were also enslaved, captured at sea, abducted from coastal villages, sold in markets in Algiers, Tunis, and Istanbul. They were fishermen, farmers, women, and children. They were white. And yet their names have vanished, their suffering has been silenced. This is the story of the forgotten white slaves. Title: The Forgotten White Slaves. On the early morning of June 20th, 1631, the Irish village of Baltimore was attacked. Barbary pirates, led by a Dutch renegade, stormed the town. They looted, burned, and kidnapped 107 people, men, women, and children. Only a few would ever return. And this was no exception. Along the coasts of Italy, France, Spain, England, the Netherlands, and even Iceland, such raids occurred. Sailors, merchants, pilgrims, and peasants were captured and sold into slavery. An estimated 1 to 1.25 million in total, white slaves, Christians in Muslim lands. The perpetrators were Barbary corsairs, pirates operating out of Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, and Sale. They attacked not only ships but also coastal villages in search of human cargo. What began as maritime piracy grew into an organized industry of slavery. These corsairs operated under the protection of Islamic states and sometimes even in collaboration with European powers. In an era of religious wars, Catholics against Protestants, Christians against Muslims, the lines between enemy and ally were often blurred. For the captives, it made no difference. They were traded like livestock. So, what happened to them, you might wonder? Many men found themselves sold as galley slaves. They were chained to rowing benches below deck, enduring the harsh conditions of being soaked in salt water for days on end. Now let's talk about the others. Some were used as construction workers, while others toiled as stable hands or miners. And the women, well, they often faced a different fate. Many were sold as domestic servants, some became nannies, and in certain cases they were forced into the role of concubines. The conditions were harsh. Abuse, rape, disease, and exhaustion were part of daily life. Yet some were integrated, converted to Islam, and even rose in rank. Slavery was not a fixed fate. It was a roulette of degradation, chance, and occasionally survival. In the Ottoman Empire, slavery was widespread. Christian boys from the Balkans were abducted through the Devşirme system, converted and trained as soldiers, the infamous Janissaries. European women were sometimes kept in harems. Slavery was justified on religious grounds. Non-believers could be enslaved. Ironically, European countries sometimes did the same, enslaving Muslims or even fellow Christians. Slavery was not about race, it was about power. There were, attempts at liberation.
Is as old as human civilization, dating back beyond recorded history, and it exists even still today. Every culture on every continent practiced some form of slavery.
Facts.
Whether it was serfdom, indentured servitude, or collective peasantry. However, when the slave trade is mentioned, people normally think of the black African slave trade to the Western Hemisphere during the colonial period from 1500 to the mid-1800s, as practiced by the European colonial powers. Estimates range from 10 to 13 million Africans being brought to the New World, with around 10 million surviving to be sold in North and South America, as well as in the Caribbean islands. Of this number, the best estimate is that 450,000 went to the British, French, and Spanish colonies in what is now the United States and Caribbean. Brazil alone received almost 5 million, the rest going to the Spanish colonies in South America. Slavery still exists in the world, yet most of the major powers ignore the fact and refuse to even acknowledge that it still exists. It is still quite active. Yet, 6 decades before the American Civil War, a war was fought by the United States on foreign shores to try and stop the white slave trade. What was the white slave trade? Does it still exist? Who were the Barbary pirates? What was the result of American intervention? How did it occur, and what was the aftermath? And how did 9 U.S. Marines and their mercenaries make history and give birth to a legendary fighting force while also ending the white slave trade in North Africa? During the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the world was on fire as France and Britain were engaged in the Napoleonic Wars, which was another series of conflicts just like the 7 Years' War, again involving every nation in Europe. The 7 Years' War was also known as the French and Indian War in the United States. Both these conflicts were fought on every continent and on every ocean and in every colony. Even during these protracted wars, the transatlantic slave trade continued. It was big business. While the European powers were destroying each other, Thomas Jefferson became the 3rd President of the United States from March 4th, 1801 to March 4th, 1809, and he had several major issues to contend with. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 from France doubled the size of the United States. The Yazoo territorial disputes in western Georgia were hotly contested. The launching of the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1804 to explore the newly acquired country, and the contested issue of slavery. In 1806, Jefferson denounced the international slave trade as a violation of human rights and called upon Congress to criminalize it. Congress responded by approving the act prohibiting importation of slaves the following year. No longer could slaves be brought from Africa, although slavery was still legal in the United States. Then there were also the rising tensions between the United States and Great Britain, which dominated the final years of Jefferson's second term, as the Royal Navy had been seizing American merchant ships and impressing sailors. However, one situation which has gone largely unnoticed in history was Jefferson being the first president to send the military overseas into direct action. The war against the Barbary pirates. For decades prior to Jefferson's accession to office, the Barbary Coast pirates of North Africa had been capturing foreign merchant and warships, stealing their valuable cargoes, and enslaving crew members, while often demanding huge ransoms for their release. Many of these ships and crews were American. Before independence, American merchant ships were protected from the Barbary pirates by the naval and diplomatic influence of Great Britain, which had threatened the use of military force should their ships be molested. However, that American protection came to an end after the colonies won their independence. The Barbary pirates also attacked the coastal northern Mediterranean, launching attacks against France, Italy, and Sicily, kidnapping women as white slaves, primarily and whenever possible, notable wealthy persons and ships for ransom.
Are you looking for
Search for white women slaves? A few pirates even went as far as the coast of Iceland, raiding inland to kidnap women and bring them back to North Africa. North African slave markets thrived, as, under Islamic law, known as Sharia, although fellow Muslims could not be enslaved, non-Muslims could be and were. Over a period of more than 300 years, it is estimated that 1 million white Europeans, to include those captured at sea as well as through land raids abroad, were enslaved. Many of these were Americans captured at sea. In 1794, in reaction to the attacks, Congress had passed a law authorizing the payment of tribute to the Barbary states. Part of that law was the Naval Act of 1794, which authorized the construction of 6 frigates, establishing the United States Navy. By the end of the 1700s, when Jefferson was Secretary of State, the United States had concluded treaties with all of the Barbary states, the Ottoman regencies of Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, along with independent Morocco. When Congress authorized $80,000 for Morocco to not molest American shipping, it was considered a good deal, as it was a cost savings when compared to the loss of ships, cargo, and sailors. The Bey of Algiers, Mustafa Baba, also agreed, and many American merchantmen were escorted by Portuguese warships, as Portugal also had a treaty with the Islamic States. But Jefferson was opposed to paying tribute, which he considered to be a modern Danegeld. When Saxon England paid the Danish Vikings not to attack, it did not work. Although Morocco and Algiers initially agreed, just weeks before Jefferson took office, Tripoli began attacking American merchant ships in an attempt to extract further tribute. Jefferson had seen enough. Jefferson tried diplomacy. In his letter to Pasha Yusuf Karamanli, emphasized, "Our sincere desire to cultivate peace and commerce with your subjects." Pasha Karamanli, the ruler of modern-day Tunisia, felt that the Americans had insulted him by not offering to pay tribute. He threatened continued actions if not so respected. Pasha Karamanli was already at war with Sweden, having broken an existing treaty. After Sweden agreed to pay annual tribute and ransom for 131 captives, 14 Swedish merchantmen had been seized by Tripolitan corsairs. Some of these were white women who were being transported on Swedish merchantmen, and it is not known if they were ever recovered, as the white women were rarely ransomed. They were highly prized and sold. The Pasha then declared war on the United States on May 14, 1801 by chopping down the flagpole at the American consulate in Tripoli, a direct act of war. Jefferson sent 3 frigates and a schooner under the command of U.S. Navy Commodore Richard Dale as a show of force and to protect U.S. ships entering the Mediterranean through the Straits of Gibraltar. Dale learned of the declaration when he reached Gibraltar on July 1st, 1801. From that point, Dale's ships blocked 2 of the Pasha's corsairs operating as raiders and messengers inside the harbor. Yusuf Karamanli was shocked at the American audacity. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, Selim III in Istanbul, was also less than amused, yet did not interfere when the Americans became involved. He had just concluded treaties with Russia and Austria and was trying to westernize his empire along Western lines. This included eliminating the white slave trade, and this position was not favored by many of his subordinate regional leaders, especially in North Africa, and they launched a revolt against him, and his cousin and successor, Mustafa IV, had him murdered in 1807. He was not about to give up such a lucrative business. The U.S. blockades halted Barbary trade and raids with Europe, but did not stop Tripoli's trade with the other Barbary states. It did, however, incite the other rulers, who considered siding with the Pasha, and they expelled their American diplomats. The United States was putting a major dent into their pirate enterprises, to include the white slave trade. The possibility of Tunis, Algiers, and Morocco joining forces as a result of losing this lucrative business became a serious concern during 1802, but in 1803, Captain Edward Preble was the new American naval commander, and he was aware of the white slave trade and piracy, and he began to deal with it. On September 12, 1803, the USS Constitution arrived off the Barbary Coast to confront the Tripolitan pirates. In October 1803, the frigate USS Philadelphia ran aground and was attacked and seized, and the 307-man crew was held for ransom. In response, on February 16, 1804, a group under Navy Lieutenant Stephen Decatur slipped into Tripoli Harbor after dark, boarded and set fires that destroyed the Philadelphia. The Pasha, in response, demanded an outrageous sum in ransom for his American hostages, even threatening death if it was not paid. In 1804, Commodore Samuel Barron, aboard the USS President, took command of 11 vessels, and he had new orders. But due to illness, he handed command of the squadron to Captain John Rogers. Jefferson had again seen enough and decided to take direct and immediate action. He sent the order. Ex-Consul William Eaton, a former Army captain who used the title of General, and United States Marine Corps First Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon, would lead a force of 8 U.S. Marines and 500 mercenaries to take Derna and free any hostages. These mercenaries were Greeks from Crete, Arabs, and Berbers, opposed to the regime, and started on a march across the desert from Alexandria, Egypt in April 1805. Their objective was to capture the Tripolitan city of Derna. The Muslim troops were under the command of Egyptian Sheikh el-Tahib, the Ottoman Empire viceroy. William Eaton, who was overbearing and not very friendly, kept himself aloof from his men and was in overall command but leading only half the group. He had a tough job controlling the largely undisciplined mercenaries, and the infighting between the Christian Greeks and Muslims, few of whom were professional soldiers, became a problem. His promises of money and loot once they took Derna was looked upon skeptically. However, O'Bannon and his 8 Marines embedded with their mercenaries shared food, hardship, water, and earned their trust. O'Bannon decided to take the Muslims from Eaton, exchanging them for his Greeks. The Marines built a strong fellowship by not denigrating the Islamic faith. They discussed their similarities and differences. O'Bannon also knew that many of these men had either been hostages themselves or had lost friends and family to the white slave trade. Eaton reported in May 1805, quote, "Our only provisions are a handful of rice and 2 biscuits a day," end quote. From March 22nd to March 30th, several Arab mercenaries under the command of Sheikh Hamid el-Tahib staged mutinies. By April 8, when he crossed the border into Libya and Tripoli, Eaton had quelled the Arab mutinies, but he could not stop the desertions. In late April, his army finally reached the port city of Bomba, some miles up the coast from Derna, where U.S. Navy warships USS Argus, Nautilus, and Hornet, with Commodore James Barron and Captain Isaac Hull, were waiting for him. Eaton received fresh supplies and the money to pay his mercenaries. Argus gave an additional cannon to the troops. On April 26, Captain Hull's ships then opened fire and bombarded Derna's batteries for an hour. Meanwhile, Eaton divided his remaining army into 2 separate attacking parties. The attack began at 14:45 hours, with Lieutenant O'Bannon and his Marines leading the attack with 50 inexperienced Greek gunners. Eaton's force was halted due to high volumes of enemy musket fire, but O'Bannon pushed his men through the inaccurate fire, as witnessed from the ships, carefully interchanging his men into various ranks to fire, advance, reload, and continue. In the process, O'Bannon's force took the fort cannons. Eaton, wounded in the left wrist, would report later that O'Bannon, his Marines, and Greeks had, quote, passed through a shower of musketry from the walls of houses, took possession of the battery, end quote. Eaton's forces caught up and turned the defenders' own abandoned guns against them, pushing them out of the city and into a well-placed ambush set up by O'Bannon just outside the main gate. During the entire battle, O'Bannon lost 2 men killed and 3 wounded Marines, with 9 of his mercenaries killed. Eaton's losses among the Muslims is unknown. O'Bannon raised the flag over the captured city at 1600 hours. They had just defeated a force 4 times their number, who were in a fortified defensive posture, and for the first time in American history, that a flag from the United States had been raised on foreign soil. Hostages were freed, and the Navy sank the pirate ships in harbor. Accurate naval fire from Argus and the other ships forced them back, and Derna remained in American hands. Yusuf reluctantly signed a peace treaty on June 10, 1805, aboard the USS Constitution. The treaty granted American ships passage through the Mediterranean without further payments of tribute and freedom from harassment. This also meant joining the other European nations in halting the very active and overt white slave trade. The war was over, and so was active white slavery from North Africa. Marine Corps legend has it that Hamet presented O'Bannon with a Mameluke sword, a sign of prestige and power. Emboldened by this event, more European nations also increased their naval presence and resisted the Barbary pirates.